Welcome to the last session for the day for the window, sorry, the square window. Well, actually, for any window, really. And we've got three wonderful speakers here, Andrew and Tiani and Tal. Um, and if Andrew, Tiani and Tal, if you can, before your talk, if you can like introduce yourself first, because some of the audience are not that familiar with all the speakers. So it would be great if you can do a short intro of yourself, if it's not part of your presentation already. So I think without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Andrew now. Andrew.
All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. Let's see, there we go. Everyone can see that? If they can't, doesn't matter. We're going to go for it. So, maps and stories, friend or foe, who has the power? I'm Andrew. They say introduce yourself. I'm not going to give you the full spiel, but I basically spent the last decade doing open source infrastructure projects and trying to help organizations be better versions of themselves, better tools and processes. I actually signed my contract to work for Red Hat sitting in the audience in the theater at MapCamp last year, so that's fun. I made a logo for myself just so you know kind of what kind of narcissist you're dealing with. And then I also come in various configurations of hair and beard. So if you see me next time, and when you can travel, you should come visit me and I'll show you all the 10-meter cactus by my house. So just to kind of go with the theme of mapping, I made a map for my talk today. And I'm sure if you're an astute mapper, you can kind of like make sense of that at a glance, right? Super easy to understand maps, right? I put MapCamp at the top, but this is actually the map for pretty much every talk I've ever given. So you can use that in future reference. So false dichotomies, friend or foe? What do you think? That was my initial impression of this question. And then I thought, well, wait a minute, stories have all the power. And then I thought a little more and I was like, that's super boring. And I don't want to be boring. We don't want to be boring, right? Do we want to be boring? So I decided to consult the internet, which is, great for these kind of things. If you've never heard of the internet, you should check it out. And what I found was the most boring animated GIF that kind of tells a story. This might be a story that some of you recognize or know. And I found this searching for maps and stories, and it turns out that there's a bunch of kind of internet presentations about maps and stories. And this one was from telling the story of a particular incident, an invasion, if you will, with maps. And so there's some other maps. So these are maps of true stories that we know. So this is kind of a framing of a beach. Something's about to happen. You kind of saw what happened a minute ago, and I'm assuming most of you know that story. This is like bigger picture of the same beach and some motions and some movements, like capturing some things happening. And then this is even bigger picture of what's happening, or what has happened. And this is essentially trying to show the bombing regimes that were happening. So there's also maps of stories we don't know. And in my internet travels, I found some very fascinating ones. And there's one I thought there's a bunch I thought were really fascinating, but this is a map of gold mine in Nevada. And so you can see there's kind of two representations. One is, the depth and like these deposits, and then the little colored squares are essentially the claims. And I think it's fascinating because if you think about each of those claims, that's a person or that's some entity, and they wanted some gold. And there's like, probably all sorts of stories about how they got to that. And then if you zoom in, one thing I thought was crazy or interesting, in the context of this, the city of London had a claim to this gold mine in Nevada. So that's kind of a interesting framing to think about, like what were the series of things that got that particular square in this particular gold mine to be claimed by the city of London. So there's also these maps of not so true stories that some of us are familiar with. I mean, who can forget, the plains of Gorgoroth or whatever, right? So it's like we all have participated in a bunch of interesting storytelling or story consuming, and you know, these are pretty famous, and there's a lot more of these. But moving on, I also found something, and this is crossing the streams a bit. There's this notion in sort of the agile, you know, universe around user stories, and then there's particular techniques that I think are useful for visualizing how those stories get combined in a useful way to help you make decisions. And I'm going to come back to this notion of decisions and purpose with respect to narratives in a minute. I also love this topic because I know Jeff Patton, and I helped him kind of get going on writing this book. And if you haven't read this book, it's a great book if you're trying to solve these kind of problems. So then there's also story maps that I found that are interesting in another sense. And I'm sure some of you have seen this particular map in the last 6 months, 9 months, or what have you. This is a fascinating tool and a fascinating website that basically gives you the ability to tell stories interactively, combining, you know, data and maps and visualizations in an interesting way. I kind of wish we didn't have this story right now, but we all do, and hopefully you're somewhere safe watching me right now. So moving on, it seems like the maps and the stories get along. I'm going to say that. We'll come back to that in a minute. And it's like you could kind of like play word games forever. At least I can, which is good and bad. But let's get some purpose. So I'm assuming you have some familiarity with St. Simon Wardley's mapping, and you know, these kind of ideas of the why of purpose and the why of movement, and you know, the Sun Tzu OODA loop stuff. So let's dive into that a little bit. And I reflected on the mapping in Simon's kind of book, and then I got to this point where I was like, we should probably define things because we could go all over the place. So story, for the most part, is going to be a narrative, and then there could be different reasons or purposes for the narrative. But to me, the key here is that you're representing things with words, and that you have this ability to say words, you know, whether they're read or listened to, and that represents ideas that you're giving to someone for whatever purpose. And then the key for me for map is this representation that shows relationships according to some convention, right? And another thing about maps that I think is interesting is when you look at the brain, that there's a significant fraction of the brain that's dedicated to processing things visually. So maps give us a way to kind of take advantage of some of that visual processing to be able to, you know, make sense of relationships and anomalies in the visualization that you don't necessarily get when you try to express these things with words. And then power is another interesting thing. So there's a couple different definitions of power. You have power as a noun, which is, you know, this superpower, this ability to act. And then you have power as a verb, which is basically to give that power to make something capable or more powerful. So that's interesting. So let's keep going. So this is, what is the purpose, right? So we had the loop and this notion of the purpose. And if you follow the thread and the thoughts, the purpose is usually to win, right? So a lot of times, if you're reading Simon stuff, it's framed around chess and games and trying to win these games. And this is from a book. This is a quote from a book. So if you want to be successful, you have to make your moves and plans on the specifics of the situation, the position, and it doesn't really matter what your moves are. This is actually from a chess book. It's a great book. So recognize the inherent imbalances of chess positions is not easy. And last time at Last Map Comp, I actually made people in the audience do chess puzzles, and we kind of proved that. And chess is this super simple turn-based game with perfect information, which we don't always have. There's nothing random, there's nothing hidden. But then you have this thing, right? So this is the OODA loop, which is also familiar, hopefully, if you've been reading, doing your homework on the Wardley mapping. And this is much more complicated than most people make it, right? So there's this cycle and there's these stages, but what do these actually mean? And the argument I made last time I was at Map Camp was that the aerial attack study is what makes OODA actionable. Like, you can't really do these things strategically unless you have this model that allows you to make decisions and think about those things. So just to kind of frame that, this is taken from the aerial attack study, which was by John Boyd as well. So I'll just kind of read like the top one. So now to perform the attack, we do not use the conventional pursuit curve approach, as this does not allow us to determine target speed and direction, and we need these factors to apply the attack we have just computed. To apply this attack correctly, we use the barrel roll type of attack. And I don't know for you, but that's sort of this evocative narrative of how these aircraft are going to interact. But the whole basis for that is this model that John Boyd builds around this kind of field of maneuver and the fighting position and these relationships and these envelopes of speed and turning capabilities that the aircraft have before you can start to impose any sort of thought of what the strategy should be. And so then we come back to this loop and the purpose and winning the game and going through this thing. And what I realized from thinking about this is that you have the why of purpose, and that really only comes from the narrative. You don't get a why of purpose from the map, from the visual. Before you can get to the meaning of the model, like you have to define this game and this purpose. And I see that very strongly coming from narrative, not from maps. And then you have the why of movement. And if you don't have a map or a model to make decisions about, there's no hope of getting a why of movement. So the why of purpose exists from the story, and then the why of movement comes from the map. So OODA, for me, kind of like reframing it through this lens, is about updating the map and model when you observe. Orient is understanding the current position on the map or model. Deciding is literally choosing the story you want to be able to tell. And then act is trying to make that story true. So this is from the talk I gave last time, is that your maps are working when you're winning more, not when you have more maps. It's about winning, not about making maps. And now I think I'm going to rephrase that a little bit. It's like, your maps are working when you have the story you want, when you're able to tell the story that you want to tell, or it helps you tell the story. So I'm going to assert that maps and stories are friends with each other and they're your friends. And then this question of power, this noun of who has the power, dun, 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 I'm going to say we do. I don't think maps or stories necessarily have more power. They don't have agency. They can't take actions. So we're the only ones with power. And maps and stories make us more powerful. So you won't always choose the best move, but hopefully you will choose your best purpose, or that's my advice to you. So with that, I think we're coming to the end. So this is another famous quote. I also wore my Tower of London t-shirt. And that's the end. So thank you. Thanks for the privilege.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for sharing your t-shirt as well. That's a nice ending to the talk. I think we're gonna get started with some questions first from Tal and maybe Tiani for Andrew. You got anything while we're waiting for questions from the audience?
Sure. I guess, Andrew, that having seen your presentation last year, and I think that the notion of what you mentioned about if you've done a good map, it tells a good story. My question is, how do you factor time into it? Like, how much time do you should you give a strategy before you either accept that it's telling or not telling the story that you wanted to tell, like once you've started to execute it?
So this is, I think there's a couple layers to the question you're asking, right? So it's like, how much time should you spend analyzing versus acting? And then there's like, does the map tell the story you want to tell? And I think, both of you are going to probably present a little bit of this as well. Is it's like when you're making a map, you're literally telling the story, and you're encoding this thing that somehow has to be decoded, unless the map's just for you, which I also kind of recommend sometimes. But for me, like the main benefit of maps and mapping as an exercise is about getting that kind of shared understanding, so that you're communicating through to another group more than like, I feel like personally I can make great decisions based on my own kind of like internal heuristics on some of these things. But if I want to express things, I want shared understanding, then you go to a map. And then this is the argument I made last year, is that you kind of have this domain of action and this domain of kind of being. And it's like, if you're living in this purely conceptual thing that you're building up, but you're not taking action, then you're not changing the story, right? You're not impacting the reality. And that's sort of this analysis paralysis problem. And I made the analogy of the Nyquist frequency, that basically you have to make actions on some notion of like what's the domain you're working in, right? So not every domain has the same time scales. So if you're in a domain like the OODA loop is from jet fighting, so your time scales have to be sub-second. If you're in some kind of economic cycle, then those cycles might be years, right? So you basically, I don't think there's a hard fast answer. And then the other thing that I borrow on, this is an American general that I got this idea from. It's called the 70-30 rule from Colin Powell. Or at least that's where I heard it from. And it's essentially that if you have more than 70% of the information you think you need to make a decision, you probably waited too long. And if you have less than like 30 or 40%, then you should probably get more information. And like it's impossible to actually measure those percentages, but like that's kind of like a nice heuristic to think about. Just like, do I have some clarity about what I'm doing and acting? Because in like a very competitive circumstance, the fact like once everyone knows exactly what's going on, it's almost too late to take advantage of it. So that's my long answer.
The question I'm sitting with in general is, and I was thinking about it even as I was working on my materials too, is how often do people actually use maps the way, you know, actual like navigational maps are used, where they build it and then they like send it off to be decoded or used in some sense for something, for some actions. Like how often or to what frequency do people do that? And is that how they actually use them? Is that the purpose that they have, is to exist as this, you know, some visual representation that someone else decodes and uses to navigate and do what they need to do?
I'll speak for myself. I feel it is exceedingly difficult to decode wordly maps. I think, like if you're just given a map without any context, with like the dots and the nodes and the edges, like I think that's hard for people to decode without some kind of interpreter, right? So one of the things that makes using a cartographic map to navigate easy is because we all have some understanding of what three-dimensional space is. We experience it like literally every second of every day, and we move through it. Where when you start to map things around, you know, what's visible and what's on what spectrum of innovation, or the genesis to the commodification, like that's a much more abstract thing. And so then when you start talking about these kind of semantically dense things you're trying to represent with maps and help make decisions, you really need, at least for me, someone to help frame exactly why they thought that. The other thing I personally find myself doing constantly when I'm evaluating maps is like, I don't think that goes there. I don't think that's a commodity, or I don't think, so there's like a bunch of other nuances that I think come into it when you're trying to use wordly maps in this fashion. And I almost always think you need that storyteller to make the wordly mapping powerful.
Yeah. Because I think we have legends, maps have legends, which are supposed to be like kind of like your decoder to some extent. But even those are not always, even in the real world, not everyone knows how to use those. You still might need a person that understands legends and some of the basic principles of navigation to still help you interpret and use it, So
like just imagine a map, right, that has a legend, and each one of these things is like represented with a color or something on the map. Whatever that legend is, that could represent something super complex. And if you don't have the background to understand what that means on that map, and I'll give you an example from my own. So it's like, I used to do like 2D or 3D visualizations from images from medical scans. So when you start to like do this stuff, there's like some super crazy things like diffusion tensor MRIs or these other things where each point in this volume has some tensor that's representing multiple dimensions of things with respect to density, like the motion of the fluid along some axes. And so if you just give someone like a legend and say, this is what this means, or this is what this is at this point, like they don't have that framing and background to necessarily make any sense of that. That's when you need the storytellers.
Yep.
So for people who you know are like new to mapping, and Andrew, what would be like your tips, and what would be the best way for them to approach, you know, mapping, learning mapping, so that they don't actually consider it a foe but a friend instead.
I I mean, I guess to me, it goes back to this kind of notion of the game and the purpose, right? So it's like, what is your actual purpose of learning maps? Is it, and to me, I never, you know, whether you're talking about agile technology or, you know, techniques or technology or whatever, like I'm not trying to get more techniques. I'm not trying to play with more technology. I have something I want to accomplish. I want certain things to be this way in the world. And so I would start with trying to understand, like, what is your actual motivation for maps? And then just like everything, and you know, the way that I approach trying to learn chess or trying to learn these other things, it's like, you got to have some kind of honest critique with yourself, some honest understanding of like, does this map represent what I want? Does it do what I want? Is it helping me make a decision better? Cool. And I kind of gave you a line for, you know, is it working? Is your story getting better? Right? Are you able to win the game you want to play? And then for me, and I already said this as well, to me, like the map and the value of mapping as an exercise is not about me drawing dots and lines. It's about getting a room full of people to agree that this dot should go here. And we all kind of like agree for the moment that we're going to have this conversation, that this particular thing is represented this way and is connected to these other things that we also build up this shared understanding of. And then we can have this group, you know, decision-making process with that shared understanding that we never would necessarily from sitting and kind of reading, you know, emails we send back and forth to each other.
Okay.
Actually, I had a follow-up question to what Tiani said before, which I thought was a really astute observation. I wanted to get Andrew's take on it, which is, you know, I've been doing mapping forever, and I've always felt like, you know, a lot of what we write down in the, you know, sort of in the X and Y axis is, you know, is the only legend you need. But I am attracted to the idea of a sort of a legend that allows people to gain context into what they're seeing when they look at a map. And I wonder if there's there's value to a sort of like, if not a legend, then maybe like a standardized abstract mechanism that gives the viewer of the map a notion of what the people who drew the map were trying to accomplish. Does that make sense?
It makes sense that we have the motivation to want that. I'm not sure how to solve that.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a solution for it, but I'm just saying it's an astute observation, because I always find that when I start with a map, I have to ask so many questions before I can even start to decipher what it means. Like we all understand commodity, utility, product, custom, genesis, all that kind of good stuff, and visible and invisible. But once you get there, it's like, what am I looking at here, right? Like it's more like, what were you guys trying to accomplish? What's this, like, you know? And you see all these things, and so much of it is context based and relevant to the discussion. And I do think there's value in sort of taking a legend-like approach to it, and saying, is there a way we could simplify it? Because what ends up happening is when we draw a map, if somebody wasn't in the room when we drew it, then it's almost impossible for them to be part of the strategy. And maybe there's a way to tie narrative or story into it in a way that when somebody who wasn't in the room looks at the map, we can use the story as a sort of legend to explain, like, this is what we were trying to accomplish, this is where we landed, and here are like 5 bullets that should catch you up.
I agree, and I was kind of trying to say the same thing earlier. I think, at least for the level of the way that things are encoded right now, you kind of need that storytelling handoff. And then you sort of made this assertion, which I kind of agree with, that we all understand, you know, what's visible to invisible, and what's commodity to like innovation. But do we necessarily have this shared understanding of what those mean, right? So like I have an understanding of what that means for me, and then we project it onto a map, and it's like, now that might, and this is the point I was making earlier, it's like, I don't always agree with where people put things on some of those spectrums.
That's a great
and
point.
And then you add the factor of time, because what you're actually trying to do when you think about these like strategic decisions you're making is understand the framing of some map and how it will evolve in time. And so then I think you're, you know, now you're introducing like another dimension that makes it even more difficult. and we didn't discuss uncertainty, because there's uncertainty. Like, I think
Yeah.
sometimes people make these things and they're like, it's like this, and it's like, probabilistically maybe, but not certainly.
Tiani, do you want to add something to that?
No, the thing that just started thinking, I started thinking as Andrew was talking, is this idea of having this like cadence of, well, how the map evolves, and the story sharing, the conversation, the activity of making it or changing it as you learn and actually like start doing things in the context that you're working in, and how often do you actually do you want to have those same people together to continue to evolve the map? Do you, as you learn now, bring in new voices because you've got to add a little bit more flavor, a little bit different angle of a viewpoint from here or there? I think that's kind of interesting. And how could you develop a cadence around that, some kind of cadence, and give it momentum and give it life as a tool that you're using to execute some kind of strategy to serve users' needs? That's
So
the
earlier
thing that
I
comes to
used
mind.
the framing, the Nyquist frequency, which is like a jargony mathematical way to say like the number of samples that you need to represent a certain curve.
Yeah.
Like over like, and it's really about time, right? So it's like
Yeah.
the sampling in time. And so I think that there is a value to thinking about, in the domain that we are trying to solve this problem in, what is the relevant frequency that we need to update our notion of certainty with respect to this representation that will allow us to make good decisions. Because, you know, if you fix this map in time, but you never update it, even though you got new information, then you probably aren't going to make good decisions, you know, going forward later.
Absolutely.
Okay, any more questions? We don't have any questions from the audience yet. Any more questions from you, Tal or Tiani, for Andrew?
No, I think that was actually,
so.
Pat, you've given me some really good ideas
Yeah.
about this notion of how do we an idea for worldly legends.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing you solve that problem. I think that's a hard problem, and I think if we had a better way to kind of represent some of these abstractions that we could share with more kind of like semantic understanding and density, then it would help people absorb the mapping much faster, much better.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like a nice project to get started with. Okay. If there are not any more questions, I think we're gonna move on to the next talk from Tiani.
Okay.
So Tiani, if you can just quickly introduce yourself as well before you.
Okay.
But yeah.
Sure. Let me get my little setup here, and then I'll do my intro. And okay. Does everyone see my screen? Okay. Okay, so hi, I'm Tiani. I work as an organizational transformation consultant for the Ready. I think my title is like socio-technologist. I got to make that up myself. So I like socio-technical systems, which fits the topic that we're talking about. My background's in engineering, and I've worked in all different types of domains, in aerospace and mobile applications and all kinds of work systems, consulting. So I think that's what really drew me to worldly mapping and working in these techniques on how to improve systems and how to look at things strategically and serving users. I kind of love doing that activity and learning about different techniques for addressing systems and complexity and user needs and things like that. Okay, so my talk is about, well, maps and stories. That's what we're all talking about, but I actually have some personal experience with map making, particularly topographic maps, from my dad, who is a cartographer for the US Geological Survey for about 30 years. And I used to hang out in the field office, and I learned a lot about map making from there, cartography. And so I thought, like, maybe there's some lessons and some insights we can draw from that activity of map making for actually doing worldly mapping. And that's the question I posed to myself. So I thought I'd do like a brief, you know, dive into the world of mapping. For those of you that are familiar with it, you'll know all this stuff, but hopefully it'll give you some nice insights. So the thing about map making is interesting because it always starts with a survey. It's typically implemented through a combination of activities, but it starts with aerial photography. And these are actually stereo photographs. They actually can be done in layers, displayed in layers. And I'll show a little bit like how they're used in the next slides. And then there's the actual land survey. And the land survey is usually a team, and they go out and have their instruments and then actually go see where the actual elevations are, the land formations, all of the natural formations, that kind of thing. And part of the survey technique that what they actually call it is going into the field. And the mapping team is typically a pair, but you could have more. So the classic tools of the topographic survey, there's like the theodolite level. They're kind of, theodolite is a telescope that can be moved on the horizontal and vertical axis to align with a measuring stake. The leveling instrument is an instrument that allows you to determine the difference between the height or points or heights of points on the vertical datum. There's a steel ribbon for measuring. It's a steel surveyor's or engineer's tape. It's usually graduated in feet or tenths and hundredths of a foot. And then you have the prism pole. They sometimes just referred to like surveyor's rod, which can be used in conjunction with your level. And that allows you to gain sight. So you can like look out over a long distance and like check over the horizontal and see where your elevation is. And you see the measurements on the pole. Some additional tools. So you have a stereo plotter. That's for allowing you to use your aerial photographs and zoom in on them and to see where and start to begin the process of drawing the elevation lines. The stereo plotter has this like little, spyglass and this like needle that allows you to start plotting. It's a pen, but it looks like a needle, and you're moving this whole instrument and you're starting to plot. And you're using the stereo photographs that determine the elevation specifically. This is kind of more of like the classical map making. There are some more newer techniques right now, but I wanted to go into like the classically, all the steps, how they do this. And then the stereo viewer, you can use that to view your stereo photographs. And then you have a scribing table, which is usually a table with a light, like a backlit table. And so you can view the maps in different layers, and you have different other instruments for zooming in and looking at elevations and seeing if you've done that correctly. This is the actual depiction of the USGS topographic mapping process. So it starts with authorization, like, yes, we're going to do this map. We need to do, this area, this state, this region, that kind of thing. There's planning activities. There's the aerial photography step, which I talked about a few slides ago. And then there's the field survey, going out in the field, and classification. And the team usually has like the main surveyor that's looking through all the instruments and writing things down in their notes. And then you have the rod man that stands there and kind of like walks out to distances and like holds the rod there so that the main surveyor can take elevations. The next step is the photogrammetry and stereo plotting, which is that big machine I said that you start to like, you spy through, and then you have that needle pen that's like tracing lines, and you're doing that with the guidance of your aerial photographs. And then the next step after that is the cartography, naming, editing, and scribing. So this is where the map actually first starts to come to life, where you can, by the time you get through scribing, the scribing step, you actually have a map that can go to be printed. And this is where scribing involves different layers. So there could be like a blue layer, and that's where you're doing the water features. There could be the green layer is elevation shading, mountains, kind of like land formation, and like a red layer could be the actual like elevation lines, for example. And then finally you go to printing, and then there's distribution. So the interesting thing that I thought of that I pulled out was that the topographic survey, that's the direct measurement of the land, the direct measurement in order to find the data about elevation points on a section of land. And you collect this data about natural and artificial features. That's the actual survey. The cartography, what the cartographer is doing is making the map. That's the map making. They're actually drawing the map of that land. So all the data that came in from the survey, they're drawing it with contour lines, elevations, hills, valleys, drainage, buildings, other improvements could be mapped on a topographic map. The interesting thing though is that the surveyor and the cartographer are typically the same person. You rarely have someone go out in the field, do the elevation gathering and all the note taking and the photographing and all of that and just hand it off to someone else. It's usually the same person or the same team, in fact. And another thing is that when the cartographer gets to their scribing table, they're actually following rules. So here's a little segment, like a zoom in of a topographic map from the US Geological Survey. There's lettering, character style, the height of the characters, the colors. There's rules that they follow to make certain information stand out the way it should in relation to other information, or to be clustered or gathered together in categories. Like the shape of the 1, the shape of the 8, the things like that, and the height and where it's positioned in relation to a line. Like you can see wherever there's numbers here, they're always dead on center to the line elevation, like 800 feet or, something like that. So the other thing that's interesting is, like, let me tell you a story about this map. So if you zoom in, you can actually see the name Arthur Jones Creek. That's my dad's name. So the interesting thing about this is that these maps, the map making process, it requires sometimes days in the field, trekking, hiking, carrying heavy equipment. In fact, my dad would have to blaze trails with a machete. He'd have to camp, and sometimes camping, with not the right shoes because unexpected weather or water conditions. One time he had Converse on and they almost melted by the fire because he had to try to dry them off. And then the interesting story though, is sometimes a map maker is surveying the land, looking at all the data that they have, understanding the topography and maybe even some of the history. But if there's an unnamed natural feature, they might just go ahead and name it for themselves or something else. So my dad in this case was able to name this creek Arthur Jones Creek, right next to Elk Creek. And if you zoom out, there's a Smith Creek or Smith River. And in fact, I tried to find some of the other ones, but there's other cases where he named them after myself. There's probably like a Tiani mountain somewhere out there, a Nahida mountain for my sister's name, my mom's name too. And the interesting thing is that this is on the record. This is like on the record, the written record. If you go to the US Geological Survey, the website, and want to download a map for Douglas County, Oregon, you print it for this segment of Douglas County, this is what you're going to see. The interesting thing about this that I think is that there are several Native American tribes that historically roam these regions. And I wonder if they had names for any of these streams already. If they had some, chosen some different names that fit to the culture and traditions, and those are not in the written record. So I think that's kind of an interesting observation that I was thinking through as I was doing the research for this talk. And so that led me to a few thoughts. First thing I think, what is the power of stories? So there could be lessons, there could be parables. The storyteller has creative license. They decide which information to reveal and highlight, what to hold back. The skill of the storyteller is something interesting. So they can use their voice inflection, emphasis, pitch, power to give life to a story. And stories can be slightly different every time, mostly because of the interaction with the audience. Like if you think of theater in a play, you may even remember things differently or notice things differently due to those interactions. Then the second thing is about the power of maps. So in the power of maps, I think, well, there's force of intent. Like making maps is like an act of curation. It's similar to storytelling. It is that you're choosing what to reveal, what to highlight, what to hold back. You also may have creative license because, like you see with my dad, he was able to name some things as he saw fit without any other information, or if there's a need for a landmark to have a name such that you can use it for navigation, he was able to do that. Then there's the power of the written record, and there's an example I gave of the Native American tribes. What have they named those streams and lakes and mountains? So there could be like social anthropological ramifications. And then the story lesson is actually derived from the activity of making the map. So I think the surveying goes hand in hand with cartography. Surveying is going to the land, going to see, going to check, going to see what's actually happening. So I actually think I came to my own conclusion that it's like a balance of power. I think stories infuse meaning and context and life into the maps. And for example, when I tell you the story about all the work that goes into map making, the trekking, the camping, the blazing trails with machetes, seeing that there's no landmark and an opportunity to name it. Did you look at the map the same way? The topographic map? Do you look at topographic maps the same way before you hear stories like that? The other thing is that I think the cartographers, they survey, if you think in terms of worldly mapping context, they're surveying the value chain. It's like going to the Gemba, the landscape, for stories in order to draw maps. Just like the cartographer needs to know about the user, how to draw the maps, whether it's a tool is, whether the tool is a Sharpie or a whiteboard, paper, a pen, a digital, they're gathering stories and they're co-curating them with a team. And that's the next point, actually, that they need a team to co-curate. If you're surveying in the topographic context, you're surveying a team, your aerial photographer, rodman, then the team comes back, they're reviewing, they're scribing, they're naming, they're doing checks of the map and saying, have we told this, have we represented the land correctly with what we know? And so there's an exchange of ideas and stories, and that goes into the written record. And I think that the last is that it requires a socio-technical approach. So the anchor is the user being served and their corresponding needs. So you have to be aware or think through exogenous, endogenous uncertainty. And if you think of like the socio-technical analysis that Tris talked about, there's the whole organization, the primary work system, the macro social phenomena. And that's where I think there's a lot of stories everywhere, particularly when you talk about the macro social phenomena. And they're all requisite to cartography. So that's what I've got.
Okay, thanks, Tiani. Okay, have we got can you stop sharing your screen?
Yeah.
Maybe? Oh, that's great. Perfect. Okay, there are no questions at the moment. Yeah, that's
I have a
very
question.
interesting story. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I was just gonna say that was a very interesting story from
So
that.
I love that, Tiani. As you know, when we were going through this, I love the whole dialogue, and the fact that your dad was a cartographer makes you uniquely qualified, probably more than anybody else, to have this conversation. The question I had that as I saw your presentation is I was wondering if we live in this world of worldly mapping, but in the world of actual like professional cartography, like when your dad was measuring mountains, all that kind of stuff, you mentioned that they were working in teams of two or something like that. What if there was a dispute over a certain measurement or a certain outcome of a map? Like if they produced a map and there was a dispute, is there like an ombudsman or something like that? Like is there like a third party that validates the map?
There is definitely a lot of review on the way to the printing. But what happens after printing, I don't know a lot about that because I was like embroiled in the pre-printing part. That's where I knew the most. But what would happen was there was several reviews, and they have the scribing table is where a lot of the rounds of the circulation and the circular back and forth feedback happens. And there's techniques for if you've made a mistake, you can actually, go and fill in the material and then rescribe it and dig out and change that material. If there is a real dispute at that step, because at that point you do see a map, it just hasn't been mass produced, they go back to the field a lot of times. They go back to the aerial photographs. They might send it. I've seen times where my dad went back out to go check something that was, they're all mulling over it, like, I'm not sure about that. Did you see that formation? Is that exactly how we measured it? Do we miss something? And they're like literally taking a field day, a long field day or overnight field trip back out to do that.
Where that question originated is actually something that Andrew said before, which is accurate. I've definitely been in the room with Simon and others before, like where we were basically sitting, essentially drawing the same map, and we all had, we all kind of put things in various places on the axes. We all sort of reach a similar conclusion, but there's a lot of dispute over where things go on the map. And so I was just wondering if there were any analogs to that in the professional cartography world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And did you have any questions? Go ahead.
I made a few notes. One interesting thing is like watching you describe this process and kind of where they're at is that this has evolved to be much more towards like the industrialization end of things than like what people do with Wardley mapping. And then related to that, I think it's an interesting point to discuss is when you talked about rules and how like there's this set of kind of like standards and conventions that they agree give you better maps. That seems to me like related to this question that we brought up last time in the last session about getting to the point where we have a better kind of way to share the understanding and like this creation of a legend. And
yeah,
exactly. I think in order to get there, like we almost need to industrialize the Wardley mapping a bit more so that those standards emerge where like you have that shared context.
Yeah, I think that's a good thought. I didn't have time to pull this up, but I found a USGS. It's pretty comprehensive legend. It's all of the symbols you use. If you have a dam, a bridge, a lock, different types of elevation point, a gate, different types of gates, a dirt road versus a paved road, a highway, freeway, everything has these, and the symbols are kind of beautiful when you look at them. And so you can go there, refer to it and say, okay, I see what kind of road this is. And you know how to draw it when you're actually doing it. And there's like this body of knowledge that's there, standard notations that help everyone more easily decode and also maybe more easily draw because they're like, okay, we're going to use these symbols. This is the way you do it. Though we might have to still agree on.
It helps the encoder and the decoder.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, it's funny because Andrew, in the world of like network topography and stuff like that, we have standardized symbols, for database and whatever. It'd be interesting to. I mean, I've got so many side projects, but it'd be interesting if somebody were to tackle, some symbology or iconography for certain things on on a Wardley map. Because like we can agree certain things are universal, like say compute, storage, that kind of stuff. Obviously there won't be anything in Genesis that will have a standardized a standardized iconography because it's new. But I think maybe
I think that's an interesting point that Tiani kind of brought out in my head is like Wardley mapping itself is like pretty close to Genesis and like custom built at best.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good point. On a Wardley mapping is still, I don't know if it's Genesis, but it's like, you're right, but it's probably like at the very tail end of Genesis.
It's certainly not a commodity, right?
No. It's definitely custom. I don't know if it's Genesis. I think that but yeah, it's right there. It's right there because that's why you can't. Yeah, you're right. It's very novel.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe there could be just like a rule of thumb that you should take some time before you start to think through some notation, shared understanding of iconography. If you have someone that can draw, maybe not. Like an X means this.
I can't.
An X means this. A dot means that.
I'm going to declare I'm gonna declare side project bankruptcy anyway, so I'm not.
Yeah.
So another thing I made a note of, and this other thing's interesting and maybe a thread to pull on, is this notion of like power. And in maps and stories, I think there's this notion. It's pretty famous. You know, there's probably like a bunch of versions of this depending on who said it, what culture, whatever. But it's like this notion that history is kind of written by the conquerors. History is written by the winners. And you point out this notion of like there were other people, there were other cultures, and they probably had
Yeah.
names for these things. And so there's like this dynamic of power. Like whoever makes the map is kind of assuming power, and whoever propagates or gets the chance to propagate the map has a certain power. So that's kind of interesting thread to pull on too.
Yeah, that was interesting. I researched there were 3 tribes and 4 different bands of tribes who currently they have a coalition, and it's that entire region, that whole map area. And I was zooming in on some of the names, and some of them look like they could be potentially culturally significant names for them. But then I was like, well, you know, Arthur Jones Creek for sure is, but it's a small creek offshoot of a larger one. So maybe it was just unnamed, and it was a way to anchor a name and a landmark there. Instead of saying unnamed, and there could be 50 unnamed intersections at Elk Creek, like, well, this one's Arthur Jones Creek branch, you know? So I thought, I don't know the full history on that, but I think it's something interesting to think about, is when you're assuming the power and what could be the ramifications, or if you, or what kind of research you could be doing, where you could go see what's been done already, or what's been, you know, how things have been categorized maybe already. If there's just, it's kind of just going to the land to see and going to the history and as part of the activity.
Okay, we've got one question actually here. Do you use symbols? And any of you can answer this. Do you use symbols on your wordly maps in addition to the usual graph dots and lines?
Tell you what I do. I use, so for me, I use by the time something is utility, it will probably have a standardized symbol, so database, network, you know, compute, that kind of thing. Then when I move to product, I start to use logos. You know, because so like, you know, and it'll be like a representative logo. So if like if I'm moving from utility to say like network, and then I want to show product, I want to talk about CDN, I might use like Akamai or something like that. Not that, you know, just because that brand will sort of light up somebody's mind and know basically what I'm talking about. Not that I'm necessarily saying use Akamai, but like something like it. You know what I mean? Prior to that. And then as I get closer to custom and Genesis, I can't, you know, that's when I start just using dots.
I actually don't think I ever have, except for maybe logos, kind of like what Tal just mentioned. But after doing this, I think I might start trying it out just to see what happens, see if it becomes useful, or, you know. Yeah.
You actually talked about the power of themes earlier. Maybe you can like expound on that in terms of like, you know, swordly mapping.
About the power of teams?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's kind of what we've toyed with this idea, or it's come up, and I think Andrew also mentioned it in his talk, is this idea of the co-creation and the conversation, the activity of making the map. And while you could do it, you can do that activity for yourself as well. But when it comes to thinking strategically and how to serve users, a team is the way to go. And what if the user is part of your team? I mean, that's kind of, you know, what we see in a lot of the agile frameworks is like, get closer to the user, do user testing, bring the user closer, demo to the, you know, all these kinds of things they kind of, you know, become part of the team in a way, because they're helping solve problems for themselves as well. So yeah, I think that's where the power is, in terms of it's how you meet where you're anchoring to the user's needs. It's how you meet their needs is by bringing a team together, multiple perspectives, and the robustness and diversity of ideas as well.
That's very important. Any more question, Andrew? Or
I would add a comment to the last bit, that you it's not just about the having like the kind of spectrum of the team, it's about getting the unity of purpose as well, right? It's like, so you need all these skills to do this, but if everyone's trying to kind of play a different game, then you might not get the best outcome.
That's a good point.
Okay, I don't think we've got any more questions from the audience, nor from the two of you. So we're running ahead, but that's okay. So if we can move on to the third talk from Tal. Last but not the least, of course. So Tal, over to you.
Tal, you're on mute, by the way.
Okay, sorry. There we go. Can you see my screen? Yes? Yes. Good. All right. Somehow I shared my screen but muted myself with the same process. Cool. So, you know, a lot of what I'll be presenting kind of dovetails on actually the previous two conversations, which is really nice. I was originally going to call this presentation "Maps Gone Wild," but that got vetoed. So we'll talk about maps and how they exist in the eye of the beholder. For those who don't know me, my name is Tal Klein. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of Brazilian. I owe the trajectory of my career to Wardley Mapping, and I do a lot of I do about 20 to 30 mapping clinics a year, you know, what I can do is I usually share, you know, kind of how I use mapping to basically create 3 companies and taking them to market and all that kind of stuff. But today I'm going to be talking a little bit, and the reason I think Simon always groups me in these story conversations is because I wrote a novel called The Punch Escrow that was a bestseller, and it's you should definitely buy it if you haven't. But I suspect a lot of people who are in this session have already read it. Anyway, so what I wanted to do for my session is talk a little bit about the cartographer, the actual person doing the mapping, holding the Sharpie or the dry erase marker. And because I feel like you know, a lot of mapping discussions discount for the skill set and the bias of the person doing the mapping. And what often happens when I'm doing a mapping clinic is that there will invariably be a moment, and those of you who have been to mapping clinic know, where somebody will ask, like I'll be doing a mapping clinic for somebody and we'll be walking through their scenario, and at some point somebody will ask me what I think. And it's a terrible idea to ask a cartographer what they think, because you know what the cartographer is there to do is to essentially you know, work within a certain series of constraints in order to map out an environment. You know, Simon loves to, if you've ever seen Simon speak, you've definitely seen this slide before, the tale of the 300 and the clash between the Greeks and the mighty army of Xerxes. And he likes to talk about how the, you know, Themistocles, I hope I'm not doing justice to his name, devised a strategy for the narrow pass where he could hold back the Persians while the Athenian navy would block the straits. And the fundamental question, so this sets up this whole story about the value of mapping, because you know this is definitely a scenario in which strategy and cartography led to a significant historical victory, akin to the one Andrew spoke about before as well. And the fundamental question here is, what if Themistocles' cartographer was inaccurate? What if the mountains here were actually hills? Meaning, what if Xerxes' army was just able to run over the hills in order to overtake the Greeks? And what if the cartographer you know, drew the line at which the water started in the wrong place? Like, what if it was a wide pass and not a narrow pass? You know, and I think there's a lot of power in creating maps, because when we create a map and then decide that that's going to be our strategy, and we commit to it, and this is kind of why I raised the question earlier when Andrew was presenting. You know, when we commit to it, there's a certain amount of time during which we must allow our strategy to play out. And during that time is sort of when all of our chips are on the table and we can't take another bet. We can't pivot. Or else we risk, we risk just having, moving from strategy to strategy without ever seeing if giving them the time to execute. So I think that I wanted to spend some time with my session talking about cartographers and the nature of cartography, and the sort of power imbued in us when we make maps and when we draw maps for ourselves or for others. And so a good example of maps gone wrong and everybody's heard some variation of this story where, somebody followed a map into a ravine or into a lake or, onto a stone road or off a mountain. And so I think there's, when Andrew and I and Tiani were talking about this session in general, he reminded me of a great notion from a wonderful book called Life, a User's Manual. And that notion is where anything that drives actions of others is encoded by the creator and then decoded with bias on both sides. So in this case, bias can be defined as, say, situational awareness. Like if the map here said there was a road, but the driver could clearly see there was no road, maybe it's a good idea to stop and ask for directions rather than blindly follow the map. But concurrently, what if the creator of the map was malevolent and wanted the person who followed the map to fall into the water or to have some sort of undesirable outcome? Another scenario that's worth exploring along that vein is the story of Garth Hill. Garth Hill is in Cardiff, UK, which is Wales. And its Welsh name is actually, I'm not going to pronounce that, but it's Mynyd y Garth. The only part that you really need to understand about that is in Welsh, that means Garth Mountain. So in here, we have a hill where in a place where heretofore was a mountain. And it's important that the definition of mountain versus hill is important and is defined as such in British cartography as a mountain is anything that's taller than 300 meters or 1,000 feet for us in America. And so around 1,000 feet, whatever. And, those, and at the time when the British cartographers went to map Garth Hill, there's a lot of distrust between the Welsh and the British. And so what the Welsh did was when the British cartographers showed up was they studied it and they realized that the British were intending on calling their mountain a hill, and they went and they added enough dirt to the top of the mountain to make it 307 meters tall, so that it would be defined as a mountain by the British cartographers, and that worked for a minute. Until it was, the British redefined the meaning of mountain such that 300 meters had to be natural height, not man-made, meaning any structure on top of a hill could not qualify into being a mountain just because the top of that structure might take it over the mountain limit, which is funny. And they actually made a movie about this called The Englishman Who Went Up a Hill But Came Down a Mountain. And the reality is that, when this was going on, in the early 20th century, it was tough to measure mountains. Surveyors used tools like I think a Klein was called, and the idea was that you could measure elevation through moving further and further back and measuring those distances, which often lacked in accuracy. They also used barometers, which was less successful because low pressure fronts could often skew the readings. And then the third one was what we talked about when I was asking Tiani about her dad, which is the triangulations between two peaks in order to determine the height of a third. But in general, what you've got here is a scenario where the British are just trying to create this map, and these cartographers show up and they're trying to create this map, and the local Welsh culture has a lot invested in this Garth being a mountain, and there was this big it was a big to-do because, you know, the village said, well, the English only come when they want something. And so they all turned to the sort of, you know, the village elder per se, or and his name was this guy, Reverend Jones. And he speculated in general on the philosophy and practice of map making. And he said, I'm going to read this verbatim. The most innocent maps were concerns with helping one from place to place, but the English had already had maps by virtue of the fact that they found the village and the mountain. So they didn't need new maps for that, and he wondered why they were trying to measure the size of the mountain. And he decided that maps were made to define the borders of property more for reasons of exclusion than inclusion. He said maps were made to measure properties for taxation, to define borders, and thus more important in times of war, as we talked about in the first map. And what would end up happening is a very simple cartographic exercise of mapping, you know, a body of land and determining whether something a hill was a mountain led to a significant sociological and anthropological issue. And so when we're mapping things, one of the things we should always consider is, even if we come into the mapping exercise without bias, even if we come into it believing that we are, you know, we are just here to do a job, we need to have a fundamental understanding of the culture that we're entering, and the map and the purpose of the map, and how it will be absorbed by that culture. That is, it's not sufficient that we remove our implicit bias. I don't think that the cartographers who were trying to map this hill or mountain had any malfeasance, but they certainly were tone deaf to the impact, the cultural impact of their work, right? And so I think that's an important note to think about as you go about your mapping. Another story that I think definitely takes that to the next level is the story of Major James Rennell, who's actually a very well-renowned cartographer. He's known as the father of oceanography. He's really well-renowned cartographer, and the world is indebted to a lot of his work. But for some reason, there's lots of speculation we'll get into later. So for some reason, when he was mapping area in what was then called, around the Gulf of Guinea, I think modern day Nigeria, I believe, there was something he did that caused a huge issue. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit more, and I'll show you what he mapped, what he added to a map that, and it was the mountains of Kong, which is actually the origin story of King Kong. Now, the mountains of Kong appeared on maps from 1978 until the 1880s. Okay, and they appeared on literally every map. So right now his map was copied by and translated into multiple languages. And basically, if you bought a world map anytime between 1778 and the late 1880s, you would basically see the mountains of Kong there. And in fact, they still occasionally will make an appearance when people borrow maps from that era. The only problem with the mountains of Kong is that they're not there. There are no mountains of Kong. And it wasn't until the late 1880s when French explorer Louis Gustave Binger, I guess, established that they weren't actually there. And this was like, this is probably, in the world of cartography, this is considered like one of the most bombastic discoveries of this, like, really well-renowned cartographer just sort of made up a mountain range in the middle of Nigeria. Because the mountain range impacted everything from treaties to trade agreements to explorations. I mean, these mountains had such a big impact. And obviously, as I said, its namesake led to the legend of King Kong, because King Kong is from the mountains of Kong. It's why he's mysterious and legendary. And it's sort of like the Bermuda Triangle, except it's not there. It's just not there. And so some people hypothesize that, Renner was just homesick and made a map to reflect his hypothesis of what was there, because he didn't actually feel like sticking around to figure out what was there. Others say he had more nefarious goals, like, again, extending the desire of the imperialist British wave to determine boundaries between protectorates and colonies, of which there were many at the time in the British Empire. So, but the point here is that, we always should think about, and again, I'm not judging this particular action. The relevance here is to the act of mapping. And so, here we've got an instance in which a mountain range exists because, the cartographer put it there. And so we're going through a mapping exercise. I think it's important that, if the cartographer of the mapper puts a dot on the graph, Andrew and I and Tiani talked about this before, about how, multiple people could draw the same map and have their, different things in different places. And so I think it's crucial to have a fundamental understanding of not only the cartographer, but the individual biases of everybody in the room. And this goes back to both Simon and Andrew's notion of purpose. And I think we need to understand the bias of the cartographer, the bias of the people in the room, so that when we tell ourselves the narrative of the story, when we explain, the map, we really should avoid components on the map that are fictional. And we should also measure ourselves to figure out why we are making, as a group, if there's a dot on the map and you don't understand or you disagree with where that dot is, that's worth 15 to 30 minutes of discussion. Because if you eschew that just because you want to get to custom Genesis product, if you say, well, never mind, we're just trying to get to the end of the story, you may be making decisions that impact the very foundation of the story you're creating, or the map that you're creating. If the mountains of Kong are fictional, can we trust any other element on that map? Can we make decisions based on that map? Right? And so I think it's crucial to take that moment and to not only to think about the individual bias of the cartographer, but the people who are watching it as well. And that's really what this, that's what this slide is saying, is like, everybody in the room needs to put their biases on the table. It's worth it. Have a group exorcism prior to starting mapping, because everybody's part of the narrative, everybody's part of the map, and we need to be able to justify our decisions based on facts and shared purpose, rather than just arbitrary bias. And with that, I turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Sal. That's great. Okay, let's just see. No questions from the audience yet. Tiani or Andrew, do you have any questions for Tal? Actually, there's this one question here. Hang on. Unless you want to go ahead. Hang on a second.
Yeah, I made a note. I can go while you're
Go ahead. Yep, go
pulling
ahead.
up the next.
Yep.
Okay. So I was thinking, like, what could be, when you're talking about, sometimes it could be, you could place something in the wrong place. It could be malevolently or otherwise. There could be some other reason. But what could be some of the business or people or strategic, like the ramifications of placing something in the wrong place? I was trying to think of some scenarios, like what could happen potentially beyond the fact that, people maybe go in the wrong direction, like be thinking a few steps ahead.
So back in the early days of infrastructure as a service, a lot of people were blindly just deciding that it was cheaper to use infrastructure as a service than be on premises. And they're making incredibly huge financial mistakes by deciding to go all in on infrastructure as a service rather than kind of build custom data centers. I think there's a horror story from Dropbox, if I recall, or I can't remember if it's Dropbox or Box, where they end up having to, they went all in on Amazon, on AWS, and then they went back because the costs were, the OpEx of cloud were, of public cloud were, was exponentially higher than the CapEx of on-prem. And so making an arbitrary decision that cloud workloads are OpEx are naturally more economical and more scalable than on-prem seems like an easy decision to make, around which you could pivot a lot of other decisions. But without testing that hypothesis, without really understanding it, it led to a huge impact on their cost of doing business.
Okay, got one question here. So you've discussed that maps and stars are similar. Are there any ways they are dissimilar?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that we want to make a map. I think there's a shared goal between a group of people. So I think usually with the exception, like as Andrew said, sometimes you make a map for yourself, and in which case I think stories and maps are almost identical. But I think when there's a group of people, I think that very rarely, do you write. I mean, and again, like maybe in cases where you're writing sort of like constitutions and that kind of notion, you're writing stories with the intention of having the group make decisions on the outcome. But usually stories and narratives are written from a single point of view, whereas I think maps are created from multiple points of view. Usually. But I know there's probably some disagreement there.
Or I have to mute myself and turn my camera off because I don't want you to hear me coughing. Bit of a sore throat. Okay, any questions for you, Andrew?
I have a bunch of notes and kind of questions and comments. I think there's this really interesting thread to pull on, this connection of this notion of categorization of mountains that happened in some of the examples, and then this like complete like misrepresentation that like mountains even exist, right? And so when you think about, and it connects back to what we're talking about now, with respect to bias, because like I could say that's a mountain and you could say it's not a mountain, and then it's like, well, what are we actually going to do about it? And I think that's an interesting thing to explore a little bit. And then I have a follow-on to that, but I want to kind of talk about just this notion of categorization and how do you bring a group to like say, okay, like we're all going to agree for the purpose of this map that these are mountains.
Right. Well, that's what the British tried to do in the first case. They tried to say a mountain is anything that's taller than 300 meters. The problem was that the Welsh weren't on board. So I think it's kind of what you said about this notion of purpose. I think part of purpose has to be a shared definitions, at least for things that belong in maybe the commodity portion of the discussion, and ideally carry over into product as well. But yeah, if you don't have, if the British are the ones drawing the map, but the Welsh are the customers, then you have a problem, right? If they don't see eye to eye.
So I think there's a bunch of questions about power dynamics that kind of keep coming up as well, and this notion of, I'm not sure I want to get into the malevolence at the moment, but this kind of like notion of the tone deafness to the culture that you just brought up again about the Welsh. And it's also connected a bit to the stuff that Tiani said. And I just had this essay in my head because I read it recently, and it's a Native American, an Indigenous American, and he gives this speech that he allows them to transcribe into words, because he starts with this kind of notion that like his tradition is oral and that you shouldn't have writing. And the essay, which is the result of this, is called "Marxism is as alien to my culture as capitalism." And it's like a fascinating thing that I don't necessarily need to explain right now. But then when you get to this notion of this power dynamics and how to resolve them, another thing that's related to this and also like this conquerors write the history and the maps is what's called Planck's principle. in science, which is basically the idea that science has never changed because people change their mind. Science advances one funeral at a time. That's usually how it's discussed. So when you have these entrenched bias and these entrenched power dynamics, I think that it's very hard to overcome them without sometimes removing the people or changing the people.
Agree. Totally agree. I don't have any response to that. Tiani, I don't know if you.
Yeah, anyway, no response to that. It makes perfect sense to me.
Another note I made on that, which I thought, I don't know, it stuck out in my head when you said it at the time, is you said that's worth having 15 minutes to 30 minutes of discussion. And the reason that stuck out in my head is it's like, that's not like, why 30? Like, why 15? And it might take a lifetime sometimes to change some of these things.
Well, I think that because at the end of the day, we want to get the map done, right? And everybody's working on, and a lot of times when you do mapping exercises, you take a lot of.
If that is your purpose, in fact, that is what you need.
Well, in the exercise, I'll just, again, for sure, but you could be open-ended forever. I'm saying usually in the clinic side, you've got a whole bunch of high-level executives, that are probably costing the company, so much money just to wait. They're taking a day out of their time to go do a mapping clinic on strategy. And so you've got this sort of like, you know how much, you've got X amount of time in which to have a strategy discussion. Some of what you could do is you could walk into the room and say, we're going to figure out our, 20-year plan, and realize that that's going to take a lot longer. And maybe we could at least figure out a 3-year plan. Right. And say, okay, in this day, we're not going to be able to get to 20 years because we've spent so much time just getting into product. We spent half the day just getting into product. Right, that by the time we get into Genesis or customer Genesis, we're just not going to get that far ahead. So I think you could reduce the scope in real time, but I think that there still needs to be an output. Otherwise, if you leave things open-ended, I don't know how much you've actually accomplished.
So what stuck out in my head is not necessarily that you're going to leave things open-ended. It's that the investment should be proportional to the outcome that you're trying to drive. And if
That's
you've got
true.
this time box engagement where the output is supposed to be this map that we agree to, then that's a different constraint than if there's this notion of we're going to update this map every week, every quarter, or whatever, and like have this kind of ongoing thing. And maybe then you got to work on the person 30 minutes a day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of times what I see is that these maps end up being an output that's actually an input into the strategic the EPA, the executive project management office or something like that, and they're like, okay, we made this map, go execute it. You know what I mean? And that's where things really break down, because those people want deeper definitions into like what exactly does this mean, and like the people who made that decision are like the CEO, the CRO, the CIO, like everybody was in the room. It's almost impossible to get that quorum again to get a deeper definition of semantics. So a lot of times that's where things get stuck, is when you hand off the execution part of the strategy to people who weren't stakeholders in the actual map creation, or weren't able to ask the questions at the time.
It's almost like you have the map, but you're missing the story, so you can't get the.
Yeah.
You can't fill in the rest.
That's why I keep going back to legend. Tiani, I'm telling you, like I'm going to spend a lot of time on this notion of legends.
Yeah, actually legends are something really interesting to me in general too. So I'm happy to like toy with that with you. But
Awesome.
The thing that I think is interesting, it keeps coming back, is like how to fit. It's like you're thinking of like transformation and new, like working in new ways, and you bring these executives together and they're now doing something that's different than they may have done in their strategic planning before. They're having different conversations. They're curating this they're co-cartographers. And then you just, like how you said that they pass it on, then that's where you've just broken like that, like what Andrew said, they've broken that, what you got, that benefit you got from to get the people together to generate the map. You've now broken that when you say, here, take the map and go. So how does the activity of storytelling, map making together become
what it reminds me
of working and become the cadence? Yeah.
You know what it reminds me of is, what's that show where Gordon Ramsay goes and fixes restaurants or whatever? Restaurant
yeah.
Hell,
Restaurant
whatever it's called.
Impossible.
Yeah, whatever. And so I always think about when he comes back a year later, and like how the businesses, because he basically created this map for them, and he's like, okay, this is your new menu, this is your new thing, this is your and he's done all this work for them. But the problem is, it's him, right? So sometimes people are able to take his map and execute on the individual components of like menu, decor, all that kind of stuff. But usually it all falls apart, right? Because if the people making the map are not stakeholders after the map's creation, if the idea of creating the map is handing it off to somebody who's going to execute it, there's a high likelihood of failure.
So I have this kind of thread swirling around how encoding maps or stories is intended to evoke certain actions, right? So it's like, I give you this map with this kind of encoded strategy that hopefully you can execute. And in some ways, I also am cycling and dwelling on this notion of like encoding intentional harm, where it's like, this notion of I wanted this thing, or I know if I produce this map that it will produce these actions, and I can use that to manipulate the outcome, maybe to my benefit, but to the detriment of others.
Yeah, I mean, that's the art of war, basically, right? Is using what you believe to be your enemy's your enemy's priorities in order to plan a strategy that accommodates for them.
So how
in this case, it's actually like, hey, here's this map. Why don't you use this to like execute your strategy that I will use against you?
Well, it's like giving your enemy. Well, in art of war is like give your enemy some small victories.
So you folks are doing a lot of like consulting work, right? To do with like mapping and all that. So when you're approaching, companies, how difficult it is to kind of make them understand and appreciate that they need this? Like,
I don't sell it.
How do you approach?
It's more inbound. Yeah, it's more inbound, and usually when it comes, the biggest problem I have is I think people, as Andrew said, I think people often expect sort of like, okay, and you're done, and it's really like a lot. I think a lot of the one of the things that's most frustrating about this work is you finally get like everybody in the room, they're all invested in this time, they're all invested in the strategy, but nobody wants to do the homework, and I think that's the hardest part of mapping is, obviously there's a lot of value to getting everybody in the room, but you're basically doing a sort of a team building exercise. I mean, you might as well just, just go and do like a ropes course or something like that. I think if what you're actually looking to do is create a map that means something to their organization, I think everyone in the room needs to commit to remaining a stakeholder and participate in the execution of that map. Otherwise, you've managed to accomplish something because you'll get everybody in the same room, seeing, visually representing a strategy, the strategy for some amount of time or for a product or for whatever. But if there's no, direct stakeholder ownership of prosecuting against the strategy, it's a waste of time.
So based on your experience,
Corporate strategy advances one funeral at a time. Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask you, like, what percentage, failure do you see? Like when you get them over that hurdle of making them appreciate that they need this map, they went through the process, it's finished.
So
yeah,
it's kind of a finishing thought because I think we're almost out of time. But I'll say that most companies are successful despite themselves. And I think that most scenarios, so much of what we call success is basically luck and not repeatable. Successful generals lose wars, lose battles. I mean, so I think the core value of, so I think that the people who are most successful at it are the people who are sort of truly vulnerable allow themselves to be vulnerable during the process and admit to shortcomings and challenges, and also respect the competition and the innovation of others in a way such that they don't assume that their innovation can't be matched or can't be surpassed. So strategy is really about, taking that humble style of approach and seeing how can we create a landscape that enables us to be successful despite our shortcomings. But in order to do that, you have to be honest with yourself and admit what the shortcomings are. And part of that is also admit what your biases are. And I think that in that scenario, there's no guarantee against failure, but it's a much higher likelihood of success.
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna wrap up soon, but if we can take like last few questions or input from the three of you, that would be great. But first, I want to thank you again for joining us or for this last session of the day. But yes, if there's anything you want to either give away as a tip, or if there's any other questions for for anyone, shall we start with Tiani?
Yeah, I mean, I think this last part of the conversation just brought home the fact that we have, with a lot of corporations and businesses, there's a need to kind of unlearn the habits that have come from like scientific management, what the managers think and then the workers kind of do. That's what came to mind when we talked about this, is handing off the map. And so I think sharing the work and sharing stories and sharing activity and kind of that working together in a new way is, I think, is where the power comes in changing, how this works and how the results they get.
Thank you for that. Tal?
I covered everything I was going to say, but I wanted to thank both Tiani and Andrew for now probably won't be able to sleep tonight because I got too many good ideas in my head. But but this is great. It's always invigorating to speak with with brilliant minds such as yourselves.
Thanks for that, Tal. And then Andrew?
So kind of pulling on the thread that both Tal and Tiani just started, I think that, and I see this in my own kind of progression, trying to learn chess and some of these other things. It's not hard for me to see the board and think, oh, like I could exploit this, I could attack this. What I'm often losing on right now is I don't see their counters. I don't see their counterattack, right? So it's like you have to give yourself an honest critique about your vulnerability sometimes to be able to win the game. And then just to close, because I really want to say this, maybe these maps and legends have been misunderstood.
Okay, thank you very much again to all of you. And I'm looking forward to that, side project about legends. So maybe that's gonna be the next talk from one of you or the three of you, who knows?
More legends to misunderstand.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you very much again for joining us. And hope we'll see you next year, hopefully in person, who knows? But yeah, it's always, wonderful. I'm sure, if you've been coming to Map Camp the past few years, this is my 4th year. I've always enjoyed it. And I'm sure, speakers and attendees have the same experience. And I know we've got a lot of new people joining us as well, because I think we have 1,600 registrations, but obviously not everyone makes it to this online things. But we're obviously going to share the videos to everyone. So thank you very much and enjoy your day. And yes, see you again.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Have a good one.